Hey everybody, Tony D with another hot take, and I gotta blast George W. Bush. Yes. Sticks and Hammer 666 did one on, and I gotta jump in on this. I have to. I've been an opponent of the Bush administration since its inception. Before he even got elected, I said, that shifty-eyed MFer, he is a criminal. He is going to jail. He is the first president to go to jail. That's what I called back in 99 or whatever. He stole the election, by the way. Read Greg Palast. Do a search for his name. He's got a whole report on how they pulled it off. And Al Gore was happy to surrender. Because he was facing a hostile Congress. And they told him, don't worry about it. We'll take it back in the next election. But George W. didn't or announced that he was not supporting Trump. And everybody's praising him. Oh, look at this. There's a Republican not supporting Trump. Yeah, no kidding. He and his whole family hate Trump because they represent nothing but the status quo. Him, Cheney, all these Washington operators, those guys were big in their time. They caused a lot of the problems we're facing now, especially on the foreign policy front. The very thing Donald Trump has been doing pretty well at. And Sticks and Hammer points this out. Everything they accused Trump of was really done by George W. Bush back in the day, which says a lot about the Democratic talking points. They're so old they creak. George W. gave us the Patriot Act. He lied us into a war, lied us into multiple wars, really. You don't remember, a lot of you, because you were too young, but understand that George Bush was sailing towards a one-term presidency before September 11th. Before September 11th, he was a joke. He was an absolute joke. And the only reason he got elected was because we just came off of 8 years of Bill Clinton, and people were pretty sick of the Democrats. Clinton had taken things too far. He had a bunch of shenanigans going on the side. People were just sick of the Democrats, and they were done with it. So they wanted a Republican. That's usually the pattern. It goes back and forth. But believe me, he was a total loser prior to September 11th. No one thought this guy was ever going to be reelected. In fact, a lot of people were like me, were saying, this guy probably won't even finish out his term. He just is a corrupt idiot, willing to say anything for the status quo. And here's the weird thing about it. They took it to the next level. George H.W. Bush had neocons in his administration, but they didn't actually have any power. He would refer to them as the crazies in the basement of the Pentagon. But when young Bush came into office, he decided those are the guys I'm definitely going to listen to. And I think that had more to do with their relationship as father and son than anything else. Plus Cheney pushed for that too. And understand that Cheney, a lot of people say he wasn't even a neocon until September 11th, and he was actually traumatized by the event. He was actually headed for a bunker when this happened, freaking out, thinking it was the end of the world. Needless to say, it wasn't, thankfully. But these two morons, let me tell you what they did in Iraq, right? And speaking of Iraq, every major news organization said it was the greatest thing since sliced bread when they invaded Iraq. Every single one of them. Chris Matthews couldn't heap enough praise on these two morons. Everybody was like, oh, George W. Bush, he's so wonderful and smart. He stood on the rubble of September 11th and led us into war to get revenge against our enemies. Duh. The only people that stood up to Bush when it was very unpopular to do so would be the Dixie Chicks and Michael Moore, and kudos for them for doing it. Keep in mind, and Pal too. Pal gets a pass for some reason because he seems so reasonable. The guy's a jerk. He's the guy who went in and told us, the Iraqis, they got these mobile weapons labs and full of drones with anthrax, and they're going to fly them over our cities and kill us all. That was what he was selling. What a bunch of BS. Donald Rumsfeld, by the way, who was in on that scheme, had a huge stake in the, I forget the name of the drug, but it's a drug that people use when they get exposed to anthrax. Yeah, I wonder why he had such a stake in that, huh? Isn't that a coincidence? Please, these guys were so friggin' corrupt. George W. Bush, the man who stood up and said, I'd like to tell you about my base, the haves and the have-mores. He actually said that. But people are trying to rebuild his image somehow. I mean, you point to George W. Bush, the worst president in history, and say, well, there's proof positive that Donald Trump's a monster. Donald Trump, whatever you think about him, by every conceivable metric, is better than George W. Bush. There is nothing you can point to that Bush even accomplished, except maybe relations in West Africa, because he did a lot of work with the AIDS crisis in West Africa, and that was good. But that's about it. Everywhere else, it wasn't a country he wouldn't bomb. He got us involved in all sorts of wars totally needlessly, completely needlessly. He let 9/11 happen. It was under his watch. It was his job to make sure that crap didn't happen. Who was watching the airports, George W.? It was supposed to be you and your guys. Who was running the FBI when the FBI didn't alert people that there were these guys taking plane lessons in Florida, and they were very interested in flying the plane, but they were completely uninterested in landing it. So, this George W. Bush, oh, here's another little tidbit. The Sunshine Policy from North and South Korea to reunite the peninsula actually started under the Bush administration. Oh, yes, because the president at that time in South Korea really wanted to reunite with the North Koreans and start that process. That process could have started in the early 2000s. They sent a fax to, I believe it was the Swedish embassy or one of the embassies in Europe, so one of the ambassadors there could tell the Bushies about it. Karl Rove said, no response. No response. They completely ignored it because they didn't want peace. Their policy was, we don't talk to dictators. How'd that work out? Pretty disastrously. The first thing they did when they go into Iraq was disband the Iraqi army. Oh, and guess what happened? They all went underground, the ones that didn't cause nothing but problems, and they had no security in the country. So imagine you get invaded by an occupying army, and they disband the police, disband the army. There's no one to protect anyone from anything. What do you think's gonna happen to your neighborhood? Do you think you'll be safe? No. So this is the kind of idiocy that was rife in the Bush administration. He would hire people that didn't know what they were doing. All the appointees to Iraq didn't speak the language. They didn't know what Iraq was. They didn't do even the slightest bit of research. They just figured, oh, we'll figure it out when we get there. How'd that work out? Not so good. A lot of people died. They were constantly fighting little skirmishes. It was a mess. Our army, our fighting force, it has been permanently degraded since the Bush administration. Now, to some extent, Trump's kind of beefed it up, mostly because he's trying to bring some of those troops home. He brought almost 10,000 troops home from Germany just recently. I hope that trend continues. He's doing it slowly and piecemeal, but the fact that he's doing it at all puts him head and shoulders above these guys. Bush couldn't send enough troops. And they told him in the beginning, you're going to take Iraq, you're going to need like 500,000 troops. The general who suggested that, fired, shown the door. And he was exactly right. Because the moment they toppled Saddam, they pulled the cork off of Iraq. And Iraq was really three different countries, three different, multiple ethnic groups and tribal divisions and religious divisions and all this stuff. And everybody told them, if you go in there and topple Saddam, Iran will be running the show. And that's exactly what's happening, because the Iranians are Shia, and in Iraq, the majority of the population is Shia. The minority of Sunni ran the Ba'athist Party. Well, when you topple Saddam, you're essentially toppling the Ba'athists and the Sunnis. And since they're a minority, and since they were basically in a civil war since we toppled Saddam, they're going to lose. Now, they were the best trained. They had the most arms and money, at least in the beginning. But over time, they're done. They're done. You've handed Iraq to Iran. That's how dumb George W. Bush is. Even by his own standards, that's a disaster. The Iraq War was called the greatest single military disaster in U.S. history. It's true. It's a disaster. Even Trump called it a disaster. That's why everybody likes him, as a president, not as a person. He speaks the truth in those regards. Jeb Bush couldn't say that. He couldn't say that the Iraq War was a disaster. He had to defend it. All these Republicans that hate Trump, they tried to defend the Iraq War. Mitt Romney, he tried to defend the Vietnam War when he was a kid. That's what these guys do. And now, where are we at? George W. Bush doesn't endorse a Republican? Well, I guess not. You weren't even close to being a Republican. Donald Trump, an 80s Democrat, closer to being a Republican than you will ever be. Oh, and the disastrous Katrina response, another instance where his appointment was just totally tone deaf and didn't know what he was doing. Or the collapse of Lehman Brothers and all the economic stuff he effed up. I mean, you could go on and on with George W. Bush. He was just the worst. He would embarrass us every time he went for a photo op. Embarrassing. One time, I forget what it was. He was on this podium. Oh, it was the guy who threw the shoe at him, but not that one. There's another one where he's given this press conference and he has to leave, and so he goes for this door, but the door's locked. So he has to change direction and go to the other side of the stage. It's so cringeworthy. The guy had no sense. He had no common sense. None. The only thing you could say about George W. Bush, he was the healthiest president we ever had. That guy rode bikes in the sun. He was fit. He was fitter than Obama, any of these guys. He was a fit MFer. This guy, he should have been a landscaper. That should have been his job. He loved the landscape. He loved to get out his chainsaw. I'm telling you, George W. is one of the most fit presidents who ever lived. Way more fit than anybody you could think of. Clinton, he was kind of fat, but he at least jogged. Obama, he was a good-looking guy, thin. He didn't do a lot, but he did stuff not like George W. George W. was just like, his resting pulse was like insane. So, that's what he spends time doing. He helps himself. You ever hear the analysis of his paintings? Those are funny too. He just has no soul in these paintings. The paintings he makes of, now that he's retired, he literally has nothing to do. He's reached the pinnacle. Yeah, he has nothing to do. At least Obama's out making movies and stuff. George W. Well, what's he gonna do? What's he gonna do? And everything they've ever said about Trump, believe me, they said 10 times worse about W. Oh my God. I had a friend, he insisted he was going to leave the country if George W. Bush got reelected. I had a guy, I'll never forget, I was doing canvassing for Ralph Nader to get him on a ballot in New Jersey. And this was for when Bush was running for reelection, and it was Bush-Kerry. And Kerry was just a terrible candidate. It was just awful. Young John Kerry would have been great. Old John Kerry, he just stumbled one thing after another, right? So Michael Moore actually said, or no, it was the Nader campaign actually said, go to a Michael Moore movie where they're showing Fahrenheit 9/11 and stand out there with your thing, see if you can get people to sign it to get Ralph Nader on the ballot, right? So I'm standing out there collecting signatures. You don't need that money that much for New Jersey. And this guy comes up, and he's clearly a lefty. And I say that not because of the way he looked, but his reaction. And he's hyperventilating. He's so angry, he's shaking with rage. He starts screeching at me. Screeching, not screaming, screeching. You're gonna get George W. Bush reelected! I'm like, what? What? No, I'm out here campaigning for Nader. That's gonna help George W. Bush! And I'm like, whoa, man, calm down. Calm down. I mean, Nader is a peace candidate. You know, Kerry's not very peaceful. And he just walked away. And then a few minutes later, he got in his car and he drove past us really fast. And I was actually afraid for my life in that moment. I kind of just stood there, stunned, and glad that he didn't, go right up the sidewalk and just take me out. That's how angry people were at Bush then. Oh, now he's a great guy. Now the liberals point to him and, he could save us from Donald Trump by not voting for him. Nonsense. He was the worst. At least Trump is competent. At least Trump gave you a good economy. Look, you have to look at the economy and say, the economy did well under Trump. And it's bouncing back already. And for those of you who say, at what price? At what price? Yeah, at what price? What has changed? He hasn't done anything different. You want to point to immigration? Obama deported way more people. If anything, he's avoided immigration by making Mexico toughen up the border on their side and building the wall. I don't agree with the wall, but it's kind of hard to argue with the results. The mere fact, the threat of deportation being taken more seriously has discouraged people in Mexico from just coming across the border. The discouragement factor alone has a huge consequence. Bush didn't care about any of these people. Bush wouldn't discuss immigration. He wouldn't treat it sensibly. He didn't care. He cared about no one. I'm not saying Trump necessarily is an altruistic guy, but my God. Bush? You're going to look at Bush and say, that's the reason not to vote for Donald Trump? Ha! Ha ha ha!